This week on the agenda, climate catastrophe. As the world gathers in Egypt for COP27, is now our last chance to save the planet. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says that when it comes to climate action, there's no time for pointing fingers or twiddling thumbs. It's time for a game-changing, quantum-level compromise between developed and emerging economies. And the place for that is the UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, taking place in Sharm-el-Sheikh, Egypt, with the strapline Together for Implementation, which hints at less talk and more action. Around 90 heads of state have said they'll be there. The first legally binding global treaty on climate change was in 2015 at COP21. The Paris Agreement committed 196 parties to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Last year at COP26 in Glasgow, we saw a flurry of new pledges around coal, deforestation, methane emissions and more. Developed countries promised to provide developing countries with $100 billion a year for climate mitigation and adaptation. But that's a target they are unlikely to reach until 2023 at the earliest. Global temperatures too were off point. Summit President Alok Sharma concluded that though 1.5 degrees remains alive, its pulse is weak. But ahead of COP27, the UN has now said there's no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees in place. And the only way to limit the climate crisis is a rapid transformation of societies. And as the onslaught of climate disasters in 2022 left little breathing space for the international community to really respond. And how far has the war in Ukraine put climate action on the back burner? After all, young activist Greta Thunberg said the last COP was little more than blah, blah, blah. As we heard there, the latest report from the United Nations Environment Programme makes for pretty grim reading. So what needs to be done at COP27 to at least try to save the planet? Joining me now from Nairobi is Niklas Hagelberg, Senior Programme Coordinator at the Climate Change Programme of the UNEP. Thanks ever so much for joining us. Now, I'd like to talk about your latest report because it said now that there's no credible pathway to that 1.5 degrees centigrade goal. So how did that happen? And does it mean that COP26 that took place in Glasgow last year failed?
Thank you, Julia, for having me. So our report focuses on the ambition of the countries, the ambition they put forward. And it's that ambition that is falling short. So we're not putting forward the ambition and then the implementation thereof to meet what scientists tells us where the emission needs to be by 2030. So we're still on a pathway towards about 2.8 degree warming. And even if we would implement everything, absolutely everything that countries have put forward, we would be on a pathway to 1.8 degrees. But that really requires us to implement everything. In terms of COP26, the one that was held last year in Glasgow, we're still, it's a progression from each of these conference of parties that they negotiate about different elements of the Paris Agreement. And in this particular COP, so last year's COP, they requested countries to go back and increase their ambition further. And I'm afraid that only a few countries put forward a stronger ambition, and that additional ambition only shaved off about 1% of the emissions that are projected for 2030.
The only way the world can limit the most severe aspects of the climate crisis is a rapid transformation of society. So how rapid are we talking, and how radical a transformation?
We're talking about a very rapid change in how business is done right now. So currently, we're still increasing emissions by about 1 to 1.1% a year. and we need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. So there's a very rapid reduction of emissions that are needed, and that will require really a transformation across all the main economic sectors, so energy, industry, agriculture, food, and forestry, transport, and buildings. And obviously it will depend a little bit from country to country, but more or less we need to employ all the climate solutions, the low carbon solutions that are there to be able to get back on a trajectory that could limit global warming to 1.5 or frankly even the 2-degree target.
Let's talk about how significant it is that COP27 is taking place in Africa. It's being billed as Africa COP. You're based in Africa, along with many of the countries who you could argue can least afford to tackle climate change. How important do you think it is that this COP is taking place where it's taking place?
Africa, indeed, as you alluded to, has the least contributions to climate change. Only 3 to max 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from this continent. And thus, Africa indeed has a big stake in how climate change is solved, how finance is coming in to help solve the climate issue. And in terms of Africa's agenda for this meeting, it's about climate finance. It's about figuring out how loss and damage, which is the part of climate disaster that is beyond what you can adapt to, where you can't build resilience anymore. For example, salt water coming into your freshwater table, or a storm has wiped out a village or a city, or where a low-lying island developing states is struggling with sea level rise. So this COP in Sharm-el-Sheikh must focus on the loss and damage items. And it's too early to say which way it will go. I believe there will be some progress on loss and damage. I believe the so-called Santiago network institutional setups will be agreed upon, and there probably will be some kind of financial commitments to finance the Santiago network. But the developing countries are also asking for a finance mechanism for loss and damage, and that's where we'll still have to see how the negotiations pans out, which starts now end of this week.
Well, China has called for this COP to really address the concerns and priorities of developing nations. How likely is that going to happen, do you think? I know you said it's possibly too early to call, but what momentum can you see?
I think there will be some progress. The Egyptian government has paid a lot of attention, so that's the incoming presidency for the Conference of Parties, have paid a lot of attention to loss and damage, and there's been quite a bit of pre-consultations and discussions before the COP has started. So I believe there's going to be some progress, especially on the institutional arrangements and technical assistance in terms of loss and damage. But I do think it's going to be quite difficult to get to where developing countries hope with the finance mechanism for loss and damage. I believe there's going to be progress on adaptation finance. So there has been a call by the Secretary General of the UN that 50% of climate finance should go to adaptation, and there's clear indication that finance is shifting towards adaptation. And there are also plenty of good opportunities of climate action that delivers both adaptation and emission reduction outcomes. So I believe there's going to be progress there as well.
Niklas Hagelberg, thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliet.
One of the countries most affected by climate change is the Maldives. At the current rate of global warming, almost 80% of the archipelago could become uninhabitable by 2050. With me now is Sabra Noordeen, Maldives Special Envoy for Climate Change. Thanks ever so much for coming on the programme. Now, the last 7 years have been the warmest on record, and the war in Ukraine has exacerbated an energy and food insecurity. So COP27 comes at a particularly critical moment, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But I would argue that all COPs have been critical for the Maldives because we've been on the front line of climate change for years. We are really hoping that COP27 is one that is about implementation. We need to see movement and strong movement on the reduction of emissions in order to make sure that we can stay on this 1.5-degree pathway. And we also need to see access and increased access to climate financing in order to make sure that we can adapt to the impact that's already taking place and address loss and damage that is increasing every year.
So what do you think is needed to really get an outcome from COP27 that's going to put the world on track to deal with these rising temperatures?
The first one is obviously reducing emissions in order to maintain our 1.5-degree pathway. The other is climate financing, and especially for vulnerable countries like the Maldives. We are in desperate need of funding for adaptation, which currently comes out of either our state budget or is only accessed through very small-scale programmed budgeting, which doesn't address the national transformational level of adaptation that even the IPCC reports pointed out that we need, especially with the impacts that's already taking place and what is projected to come if we don't mitigate as much as we need to.
What kind of figures are we talking for the Maldives alone?
Well, it's unfortunately billions for the Maldives alone as well. Even because the Maldives is so small, infrastructure such as coastal protection is very expensive. But that is what we have to adapt with in order to deal with rising sea levels and also tidal surges.
So you've said that the Maldives needs to incorporate more resilience into everything you do. Does the whole world need to do the same if we're going to stick to, let's face it, what are pretty tough climate goals?
Yes, I do. I think we all need to make climate resilience central to everything we do. And in the Maldives, we can do better in terms of how every single infrastructure project that we carry out in the Maldives has to address the climate impact. We have to build with the knowledge that the sea level is rising. But there's also limits to that level of adaptation and how high we can build up and the amount of funding that's available to do that. So yes, I think it is very important for everybody to keep climate resilience at the center of everything we do.
Many people are already talking about COP27 as Africa COP because of where it's taking place. And Africa does remain one of the most vulnerable continents to climate change, despite its very low contribution to greenhouse gas emissions compared to other more industrialized parts of the world. So how can Africa, do you think, show leadership in this area?
I think Africa is already showing leadership, especially in terms of climate advocacy, because they're one of the most vulnerable and hardest hit when it comes to climate impact. But where they can also show an example is to show that we can achieve levels of development without relying on the old fossil fuel structure, and we can turn to renewables and more climate friendly and climate resilient infrastructure in order to reach those levels of development.
Now, there was a lot of talking at COP26. I mean, Greta Thunberg said it was just lots of blah, 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 but it did talk about the importance to scale up appropriate finance. They talked about this resilience, strengthening and reducing vulnerability to climate change. Do you think that COP27 is going to have similar goals, going to concentrate on more of the same and can deliver on those things?
Well, we're still waiting on the $100 billion a year goal to be met, and that those figures will still be up for discussion, but also we're going to be looking at what comes after that goal has been met. And for us, for the Maldives, the Global Goal on Adaptation, the 2-year work program, which was decided on in Glasgow last year, is very important because that sets the metrics for how we measure what kind of adaptation is needed and what kind of adaptation is taking place and how much is needed to actually implement that level of adaptation. So yes, I think, there is going to be a lot more talking again, but it does bring about progress. I mean, not at the pace that the science requires, and not at the pace that we would necessarily like it to be at, but it does bring us a level of progress.
You talk about that crucial $100 billion pledge from developed nations to developing nations, which, as you say, they haven't quite met yet.
Yes.
Is this loss and damage piece a little bit like climate reparations? Is that what it is?
I think it's more of an aspect of climate justice, that the highest emitters in the world have, got us to this point. But it's not always the ones that have emitted the most that are feeling the impacts at the quickest or even the hardest. So addressing loss and damage, which we have to do now more regularly because of the increase in the intensity of events that are taking place, I mean, even this year alone, is climate justice, is a form of climate justice. And with the pandemic, we have seen that billions and billions of dollars were raised within a very short time frame to address immediate, medical emergencies and livelihood issues. So the money is there, and I think we can mobilize it. It's just we haven't seen it yet.
So what needs to be done to make sure that this COP27, taking place in Sharm-el-Sheikh, isn't a missed opportunity and it is a chance to actually mobilize action to tackle the climate emergency?
Firstly, we need to see greater ambition and a drastic reduction in emissions. Without this, the progress we make in other issues may be meaningless. And secondly, I think, we need the international financial system to come together to find a way to provide the most vulnerable countries with the access and the appropriate amount of funding that is needed to adapt to the current situation and what's projected to come as the crisis gets worse.
You've stressed the importance of climate finance, and you mentioned the pandemic when funds were raised pretty quickly all around the world to deal with that health emergency. But in terms of climate, that $100 billion pledge from developing nations still hasn't been met and probably won't be met before 2023. So what are we going to do about it? How are you going to get there?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think everyone needs to come to the realization that the climate crisis should be at the center of all the policy making that we do, and that it is linked to the geopolitical situation, whether it's the energy crisis or conflict. And in that way, we need to drastically reduce our emissions and come up with a system that allows us increased access to climate finance in order to adapt and to address loss and damage.
Sabra Noordeen, absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Still to come here on the agenda, a greener China, how the country plans to become carbon neutral by 2060.
Roger, reading you loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story, may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to The Agenda. At the recent 20th CPC Congress in Beijing, President Xi Jinping said it was time to speed up China's green transformation. But what exactly does that look like? And what will China be bringing to the table at COP27? Well, with me now from Beijing is environmentalist and director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, Ma Jun. Thanks for coming on the programme. Now, climate policy is one of the Chinese government's top priorities. How do you think things have changed since the last time the world gathered at COP26 in Glasgow last year?
Yeah, last year we met in Glasgow and reached a very during a very tough situation. And this year, I have to say the situation is not easier at all. We're facing a global energy crisis with the surging energy price, and the pandemic, COVID pandemic, still linger on, and we're facing a real rising geopolitical tension with a war in Europe. All this have made major economies ramp up their fossil fuel production, and this is going to have a profound impact on the global climate response. And I think that this is just a harsh reminder that the transition to low carbon is far from being accomplished. And that's why I think it's very important for President Xi to note in the Party Congress that China must accelerate the green transformation. So I hope that in this COP27, all the countries could note that and hasten the process towards a low carbon transition.
And what are you hoping is going to emerge from COP27?
Yeah, in the COP27, with all these multiple challenges, I hope, of course, to see first and foremost China stick to the carbon peak and neutrality target, and continue to support the global climate governance. And in the meantime, I think it's very important for all the countries to build up trust and confidence. At this moment, there's unfortunately a lot of misinformation spread especially through social media on the situation in other parts of the world. So I think at this moment, unity and collaboration is extremely important. So how to build up trust, how to build up confidence in this COP27 is crucial. And in the meantime, this will be a COP meeting held in a developing country. So I think many developing countries have high expectations, and we need to seriously try to meet up with their expectation.
Well, speaking of expectations, China has, of course, committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2060. Is that soon enough?
Carbon neutrality by China is extremely important. China is now the largest current greenhouse gas emitter, and China's carbon dioxide emission is about close to one third of the global total. So it is very important for China to neutralize it. It's more than 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide, along with other non-carbon CO2 greenhouse gases. Although this is going to be later than some of the Western countries, But we need to keep in mind that China is still going through this massive industrialization and urbanization, and the time frame between China's the peaking of the carbon emission and the carbon neutrality will be the shortest in the world. So the challenge is really big, and China's commitment will be crucial for the whole world.
Energy security is one of the key factors which will underpin many conversations, no doubt, at COP27. How is China approaching things in that area?
China is at this moment, the central government have decided to spare no efforts to ensure energy security, because this is so important to China's stability and social economic development. As I mentioned, China is releasing some of the coal capacity and try to use coal to serve as the base load. Unfortunately, at this moment, China is only rich in the coal resources, so that has become the primary source to ensure energy security. But in the mid to long term, China is going to have to depend more on the renewable energy. So China has been making massive investment on renewable energy, and China has already have the world's largest renewable energy capacity for both wind and solar. And in the meantime, China have drafted plans to build some new renewable energy bases in the western part of the country, and along the coast try to build all this offshore wind and even offshore solar.
Marjorie, international relations are at a difficult stage as we speak, and there's a worldwide squeeze on the cost of living. How hopeful are you that real progress can be made at COP27 as it takes place amidst these ongoing global crises?
Yeah, that's a key question. I think at the COP27, first and foremost, we need to try to consolidate what has already been committed, and all this commitment. We hope that they can be honored, and China's taking its own action to try to implement all this, and I hope that in other parts of the world it will be the same. Of course, including some of the commitment made to support the underdeveloped country to adapt to climate change. That commitment has been delayed for too long. And in the meantime, we need to understand that major economies, the central government of major economies, all pay attention to the security of energy, food, and supply chain. So it is very important for the other stakeholders to take action. From Paris to Glasgow, so many companies and banks and investors have made ambitious climate commitments as well.
Marjorie, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, the forgotten allies, the truth behind the scandalous tale of Chinese sailors forced out of Britain after the Second World War. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all of the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.